Lesson 3, how past rulings are applied to new realities. In lesson number 1, we learned about how much we can learn from the questions that people have asked in the Responsa questions. There's so much we can learn just from the questions. And we learn about the commitment that the Jewish people have had historically to Torah values. That's been tremendous. That in the most dire of situations would ask questions. We learned a lot about the history of the Jewish people from the questions that they're asking. In lesson number 2, we learned how rabbis making decisions is not hocus pocus. They have to know the facts on the ground, which should be obvious to anyone to know that if you're making a decision about something, you have to know what's going on. Similar to counseling, you have to hear both sides of the story. If you don't hear both sides of the story, you don't know both sides of the story, and you think you know the story. Very dangerous. So we learned last week about how rabbis would delve into the study of different realities on the ground to understand what the reality of a certain type of a chicken is, right? Or any other types of realities, what causes the Nile River to rise, whatever it may be. They have to know that, and that has nothing to do specifically with Torah. The Torah doesn't tell us about that. The study of the world does, and investigation, but that will thereby permit us to be able to answer questions that are the halachic questions, Jewish law questions, because now that we know the facts, now we can apply the Torah rulings and rules and guidelines to the facts. This week, we're going to go to the more classic aspect of what a rabbi does, and that is applying Talmudic principles and halachic texts to questions that come up. Because often, you see, there are explicit laws in the Torah. For example, if someone comes to a rabbi and says, "Rabbi, am I allowed to light a match on Shabbos?" That's a very explicit law in the Torah. The Torah explicitly says one is not allowed to ignite a fire on Shabbos. If someone wants to know whether they are allowed to work during the week that they are sitting Shiva for a parent or for a loved one that they are required to sit Shiva for, the answer is no. It's an explicit law. One is not meant to work during the week of Shiva. If someone wants to know, "Rabbi, I know you're not allowed to cook milk and meat, but how about almond milk? Can I cook my meat with almond milk?" And because almond milk is not dairy, right? And the answer to that question is that is permissible. However, in the Code of Jewish Law, it explicitly states that you should make sure to put either almonds on the plate or something of that sort so that people will know it's not real milk, but it's almond milk. Or you can simply put today has become a stock item in many homes. You just put the bottle on the table. It says almond milk. That would be the same thing as putting almonds on the table, etc. Arguably even, which I don't want to go into this tangent now, you may not even need some of these elements today, but that's a separate conversation. But these are all explicit laws. So for an explicit law, you just need a knowledgeable rabbi. However, there's a far more profound level of rabbinics and being a rabbi than just having knowledge, and that is extrapolating. Being able to take a scenario which is not explicit, which requires applying a case study, which would be analogous in some way to this case. And through this case study, you can actually know what to do with the situation that was put before you. Now, that requires tremendous, tremendous skill. And that's where real wisdom is demonstrated by select rabbis who are very advanced in this way. Now, I want to be clear, I always like to emphasize this. Rabbis are not allowed to make decisions based on intuition, which means I get a sense that. We really are not here to hear what a particular rabbi's feelings or senses are. If a rabbi is going to make a ruling, we want to know what the Torah ruling is, not what your ruling is. It's very different than a judge in many cases in a secular court, where they take in all this information and then they say, based on everything I heard, my assessment is. We don't want to know a rabbi's assessment. We want to know what the Torah says. And in order for us to know what the Torah says, the rabbi has to bring evidence from the Torah. And if they bring evidence from the Torah, fantastic. Then they have a strong, compelling argument. And unless another rabbi can refute that from the Torah, then we trust that this rabbi is, as we learned last week, Hashem Imo, God is with him, and that his teaching with the verification he brings from the Torah is accurate, and that is the law. And so what they will often do is, typically what a rabbi of this caliber is going to do is they're going to uncover principles that we see in the Torah, in the Mishnah, or in the Talmud, and analogous cases that reveal principles. Sometimes you have a law in the Talmud, as we're going to see tonight, that is a story and they tell us a ruling. But when you begin to pay closer attention to the story and the ruling, you understand the principle behind it, and then you can apply that principle to other scenarios as well. And what's very fascinating is that the very first person to do this type of work was none other than the genius rabbi of all genius rabbis, a man by you may have heard of. His name was Moses. So just a moment. So Moses did this. He used comparative reasoning to break the tablets. Could you imagine? God gives Moses the tablets. Made in heaven. It's made in heaven. Where he has these tablets and he's coming down from the mountain and he discovers that the Jews are worshiping an idol. A bunch of the Jews are worshiping an idol, right? Would you take the tablets that God just gave you and just smash them? I mean, that's a pretty bold thing to do. God didn't tell him to do that. It was a decision Moses made on his own. Where did he come up with this decision? So we actually learn that Moses had, I'm sorry, I jumped to the video, that Moses had a comparative reasoning, which is what he used in order to determine this. This is what he learned. Actually, let's go to text number 1. And by the way, tonight, I hope it's going to be okay with you, but I'm going to read all the texts because I don't have a smooth way of doing that with all of us here on Zoom. Okay, so text number 1, which is on page 103 in your student book. This is from the Talmud, Tractate Shabbos. What reasoning did Moses apply to break the tablets? What was his thinking? He surely had some thought process. Not only did he have a thought process, he had to have a thought process that was aligned with God's thought process. So this is what he said. He worked off of God's thinking. He said, I was explicitly told that an idol worshiper may not eat from the Paschal lamb, which is only one of the 613 mitzvot. So he said, I learned that if someone is an idolater, this we learned in the Torah, in Exodus, if someone's an idolater, they're not allowed to participate in the eating of the Paschal lamb. Every year on Passover Eve, when we sit down to have the Seder, when we had our holy temple, we had the Seder in Jerusalem. May it be so this year. And what we ate for the Afikomen was not a piece of matzah, but it was the Paschal lamb. It was lamb chops. And it was done in a particular fashion with groups, etc. But only certain people are allowed to participate in the eating of the Paschal lamb, and that's namely Jews. If someone's an idolater, they're not allowed to. So Moses said, the eating of the Paschal lamb is one of 613 commandments, and God says if someone's an idolater, they cannot observe this mitzvah. If so, now that Israel has worshipped the golden calf, they are certainly unworthy of receiving all 613 mitzvot. If an idolater can't do one mitzvah, surely he can't receive all 613, even one he can't do. That was his reasoning. We're not going to overanalyze this as the commentaries on the Talmud do. You can really superanalyze this. But the key point I just want to bring out is this one point. And that is that Moses had a thought process that came out of the thinking of God, not out of his own thinking. And based on that, that's how he made a decision. And what's really fascinating is, So you have over here, oh yeah, I did it again. So you have over here, Moses used comparative reasoning to break the tablets. One who worships idols doesn't deserve one mitzvah. If someone who worships idols doesn't deserve one mitzvah, then surely he doesn't deserve to receive all the mitzvahs. And here's the fascinating thing that we are taught. The Midrash tells us, and Rashi writes this in the very final commentary of Rashi on the Torah. Yasher kocha, they write over here Yasher koach, but actually the literal terminology was Yasher kocha shivarta. God said, Yasher koach, thank you. Pat on the back for breaking the tablets. In other words, God approved of it. Because God always approves a decision we make when the decision we are making is derived from the Torah to the best of our ability. That's part of our way of partnering with God. Okay? So God wants us to do that. And so, one of the challenges of being a halachic authority is, second guessing yourself. Like, how do I know? But how do I know? Now, one good thing to always do is to speak with colleagues. That's definitely a very good idea. However, in general, the very notion that the very knowing that the rabbi has that I based this decision based on Torah principles, that alone tells him I did everything I could with the intellect God has given me. God is with me, and therefore therefore I'm going to give this ruling. So that's how rabbis make this ruling. We're going to now study some examples of this throughout history. As we have in the past two classes, we're going to begin with a very fascinating story. You may have heard of a terminology called blood libels. Tragically, we all know what they are. And this story takes us back to the year 1476 in Germany, I believe it was. And we're going to watch the video. Actually, excuse me for one moment. I have to stop the sharing and reshare because I have to make sure it's optimized for video. Sharing. Okay, this is going to work much better. Okay, and we're going to watch this video, and then which is going to give us the background of the story, and then we're going to jump into the discussion. Here we go.
In the spring of 1475, the city of Trent in northern Italy became the site of a tragedy. The body of 2-year-old Simon was found in a canal beneath the home of a Jewish family. Within days, all 18 Jewish men of the city were arrested. Under torture, they confessed to murdering the boy to use his blood in a Jewish ritual, an accusation with no basis in Jewish law or practice. All 18 were sentenced to death. The Jewish community of Trent was effectively erased. But the story didn't end there. A year later, in 1476, Bishop Heinrich of Regensburg passed through Trent on his way home from Rome. He learned that one of the tortured men had named Jews in Regensburg, accusing them of committing a similar crime nearly a decade earlier. Heinrich brought the confessions back to Regensburg. In the spring of 1476, the city arrested 17 of its most prominent Jews. Their families were placed under house arrest. Jewish assets across the city were frozen, and the torture began again. Some of the accused
I am sorry, let's see.
resisted. Others broke under pressure. The resulting confessions were contradictory and confused. Dates didn't line up. Locations varied widely. Yet the authorities pressed on. They needed physical proof. So on April 22nd, 1476, the cellar of one of the accused was excavated. After 3 days, bones were discovered, said to be the remains of 4 children. But doubts quickly surfaced. Ronnie Pochashar, in The Myth of Ritual Murder, writes, according to a legal brief in defense of the 17 Jews and presented at the imperial court, the excavation was not supervised by disinterested parties. Soldiers and authorities were not called in until the 3rd day, and one soldier actually expressed his distrust of the workers entrusted with the digging. Some thought the bones had been planted to frame the Jews. Men were seen removing bones from the Christian cemetery. At the imperial court in Vienna, Emperor Frederick III ordered the Jews' release. Regensburg officials resisted, asserting their city's autonomy for criminal cases. A tense standoff dragged on until May 1478, when a compromise was reached. The prisoners would be freed, but only after paying an exorbitant sum, 10,000 florins to the emperor, 5,000 to the city for the trial and prison costs, 8,000 more to cover a fine the emperor had levied against the city for their disobedience in this case. In total, 23,000 florins, an impossible sum. Though Jews across the region gave generously, it wasn't enough. The prisoners remained locked away. German rabbis convened in Nuremberg. Should they impose a tax on every Jewish community in the empire to free the Jews of Regensburg? How far could they go to buy justice?
Okay, so if you followed that story, just give me a moment. Is this not opening? Okay, so if you followed that story, you got a picture. Sorry, just give me 1 second here. Okay. Okay. So if you follow that story, you got the picture that here there was a little town in Trent. Every Jewish man, all 17 Jewish men, were murdered based on the blood libel. And now we have in Regensburg the bishop of all people. Usually it was the Christian leaders who led these blood libels, accused 17 Jewish men falsely of murder. You can tell from the admissions that the admissions were forced admissions because there were different stories, and freeing them came at an exorbitant cost. You had the emperor involved. You had the actual city of Regensburg who argued that they're not under the authority of the emperor. The emperor imposes a fine on the city. The city imposes that fine on the Jews. So really, it all gets passed right back out to the Jews. The rabbis were inclined to impose a tax on other Jewish communities of the Holy Roman Empire. And this is our question. The rabbis want to know whether they have the authority, being that the fine was so great. There's no way that they were going to be able to raise this money in Regensburg alone. They tried, but extremely unsuccessfully to reach such a high number. And they wanted to know whether they can reach out to other cities and say, look, there's a tax we are putting on all Jews in the Holy Roman Empire to cover this cost. They weren't sure of the legitimacy of the tax. So what did they do? They did what a good Jew does. They reached out for guidance from a very prominent halachic authority. There was no precedent for one city to tax another city, right? That's an unusual thing. So is that something they can do? And there's a difference between charity and tax. Charity is given willingly. Also, it doesn't apply to everybody, and it doesn't apply. Everyone may be different. When it comes to a tax is imposed on every single resident. That means rich or poor, everyone has to pitch in. However, the tax is going to be, is going to be imposed on the people, whether it's, per income or whatever it may be. But everyone then has to participate in it. So can they compel all Jews to help the Jews of Regensburg? And it's also a question of, are we going to solve the world's problems? Like whenever there's a problem going on in the world, can we now impose it on everybody? Everyone's got to solve every problem that's going on somewhere in the world. Not to diminish from the enormous tragedy, but still, this is what was on there. This was their question, and this is what they felt they needed to do in order to save their community. So the first question that we have, if you go to page 106, is the question on page 106, can all Jews in the Holy Roman Empire be taxed to fund the release of the Jews in Regensburg, or are Jewish authorities restricted to making appeals for voluntary charitable donations? No, you can't impose anything. And you can you can make appeal to people to give, but you can't impose. That is the question. So this question they sent to the prominent Rabbi Yosef Kolon, otherwise known as the Maharik. And the way they get these names, these nicknames, is by acronym of the rabbi. Maharik stands for Moreno, our master. Harav, the rabbi. And then you have a Yud, Yosef, and the Rik, the K at the end is Cologne. From PAVIA, Italy, which was, I don't believe, was very far from Regensburg. And they reached out to him and said, can we impose a tax on all the Jews in the Holy Roman Empire? Okay? So, what did the Maharik do? How is he going to decide such a question? Thank you. The way he decides this question is, I don't know if there's a cup somewhere. I don't know if there's a glass cup. The way they decide this question is very simple, as you all know already. He has to find precedent in the Talmud in order to prove whatever point he's going to make, or in the Torah. Somewhere from the Torah, he's got to demonstrate something analogous. So the question is, can all Jews in the Holy Roman Empire be taxed to fund the release of the Jews of Regensburg? That's the question he's dealing with. And okay, and here is what the precedent that he came up with. And of course, firstly, you have to be fluent in the Talmud, which is thousands and thousands of pages. I didn't even learn the whole Talmud. This rabbi learned the whole Talmud and knew it by heart, and had the creativity to be able to think and find which scenarios in the Talmud would relate to this story. If you look in your book, you're going to see exercise 3.1, which you can also relates to the image on the screen, or that you have in your the image on the screen. A river flows through multiple communities. Over time, the sedimentation causes reduced downstream flow. Now, over time, being that this river flows through multiple communities, there's sediment that collects, and it slows down the flow to the lower communities. Who is responsible for the sediment removal? So if you see in the image here on the screen, you have A, B, and C. A is upstream, B is midstream, and C is downstream. And the sediment in case one, which we're discussing, is right in the middle over there by B. So do we say it's C's problem? C's got to figure out to take care of the sediment. Do we say it's B also has to participate, that everyone, even A, who it's not really affecting, has to participate? That is the question. Those are your options. And what would you say? I ask you, what would you say? Would you say that all communities have to participate? Only B and C, or only, or actually only upstream that they give as an option, or only the upstream is the one? Maybe because the upstream is the one who's maybe causing the problem, right? That is the figure 3.1, and a scenario that the Talmud discusses, which we're going to break down what the Talmud says about it in just a few minutes. And then we have let's see. Oh, so B, by the way, just to clarify the story, B and C are downstream of the blockage. C is further downstream, and B is less downstream. Okay. Then we have a second scenario, which is case number 2, which you can see in exercise 3.2, a drainage canal. This is something different. It's not a river. It's specifically a drainage canal that, in order to make sure that the roads don't get muddy, they made a canal alongside the road. So when it rains, the water will run alongside the canal. And in running alongside in the canal, alongside the road in the canal, and this will avoid the roads from getting muddy. Now, a drainage canal that removes water from roads serves multiple communities on the hillside. The canal becomes clogged, preventing water from draining. You see, In the case number one, when there's sediment blocking the river from flowing downstream, whose problem is it practically? It's the problem of B and C, of the lower of the downstream communities, because they need water, they're not getting their water, or they're not getting enough. When you have a canal that's a drainage canal, and that gets blocked, and that basically the water now cannot go down, so it stays up, starts spilling all over on the road. Not solving the problem it was intended for. Whose problem it is? It's A's problem. So it's just basically a reverse scenario, and the question is, who's responsible to remove the blockage? All communities that rely on the drainage canal, which would be A, B, and C, you all use the drainage canal, so then you all have to participate. Only those downhill below the blockage, only those that are downhill below the blockage, or only those uphill above the blockage, which in this case they say is A and B. Okay, so these are the questions that we have, and we did not invent these questions. These questions are a scenario from the Talmud. Let's look at text 4a. So on text 4a, why doesn't it let me see them? Okay. So on text 4a, the Talmud says something that will sound to you, I think, a little bit mysterious, because the Talmud often articulates itself in an unusual way. And then we have commentaries like Rashi, as we'll see in text 4b, who explains to us what the Talmud is saying. So in text 4a, Rabbi Yehuda taught, concerning the digging of a river, the lower ones must assist the upper ones. But the upper ones need not assist the lower ones. The reverse is true regarding draining rainwater. Okay, what is Rabbi Yehuda saying exactly? You may have made out what he's saying, but to clarify it more clearly, let's read text 4b. When those upstream repair the obstruction in the river, so we're talking about case number one, there's a river flowing, and now there's sedimentation, and it's blocking the water from getting to the lower towns. When those upstream repair the obstruction in the river that's adjacent to their town, like when B repairs their sedimentation adjacent to their town, the downstream communities are obligated to assist them. Why? Since a blockage upstream prevents water from flowing toward them. Thus, fixing the upper sections benefits those downstream. Let me give you the key to what the Talmud is saying, to Rabbi Yehuda is saying, which Rashi here is explaining. If you are a beneficiary of the removal of the sedimentation, then you have an obligation to help get rid of it. That's what the Talmud is saying. So B and C are obligated to get rid of the sedimentation together. C can't say to B, well, it's happening by you, it's your problem. No, B says, this is my problem and this is your problem, and we're both going to benefit from removing it. A has no benefit from removing sedimentation. They are not a beneficiary of it, so they're not obligated to participate. Now, of course, as Jews, you see your friend struggling, shoveling your snow, you pull out your shovel, you help him out, you take your snowblower and you say, hey, let me help you out, it was a big snow, let me clear your driveway for you, right? But that's not an obligation. That's a beautiful act of kindness. The Talmud is talking about obligation, and the Talmud says one is not obligated. But, continues Rashi, explaining the Talmud, what Rabbi Yehuda said, the upper ones need not assist the lower ones when repairs are made downstream, because these do not benefit those upstream. So Rashi says explicitly, A does not have to participate. In fact, the repairs below harm those upstream. The more water that rushes forward, the less water is available upstream, which risks their fields drying out. It actually harms them. Not that they have more rights to the river, but still, it actually diminishes their amount of water. Now, let's talk about the draining system. The canal alongside the road. The reverse is true regarding draining rainwater. This applies to a city where excessive rainwater causes mud buildup and road damage. So a drainage channel is built to divert water outside the city. If a blockage occurs in the section belonging to the lower residents, requiring it to be dug out, those upstream must assist in clearing it. Now the upstream guys have to assist. Why? Because they're going to be a beneficiary. Because if it's not cleared out, their road is going to be flooded. Because as long as the lower section remains clogged, water will accumulate and flood the upper areas. However, the lower ones that are lower than the blockage have no obligation to assist the upper ones in clearing the drainage blockages in the higher area, because the residents below favor that the upper water does not drain to the lower area. The lower guys are happy. Our road is dry. All the water is staying up there. Fantastic. It's not our problem. We have no benefit by enhancing the canal. Now, obviously, I just want to say, because we always have some what ifs in the class who like to ask, like, what if, or what do you mean? The Talmud is painting a particular scenario. Obviously, if the overflow eventually is going to hurt the lower towns, they would also have to participate. But the Talmud is painting a scenario where it's going to become the problem of the upstream towns and not the downstream towns. And in that case, bottom line, what do we see in both cases, case 1 and case 2? You only have an obligation to participate in this communal repair if you are a beneficiary. I hope that's clear. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask me, but I hope that that's clear. So one pays for what they benefit for. You don't benefit, you don't have to pay. That's the ruling of the Talmud. And this, all the Maharik, Rabbi Yosef Cologne of Pavia, Italy, is going to use now for a ruling regarding whether the Regensburg leaders can tax the entire Holy Roman Empire, which is far beyond their own city. Now let's go to page number 111, and let's look at the question. Well, actually, let me just finish our slide over here. Right, so this was the question: who is responsible? And the answer was that in case number 1, B and C are responsible, the downstream towns are responsible, and when it comes to a canal blockage, a drainage blockage, then the upstream towns would be responsible. Okay. How might this Talmudic passage apply to the question of the funding the release in Regensburg? Have you been able to figure out yet how the Maharik, Rabbi Yosef Cologne, is using this Talmud to explain whether you can tax the entire Holy Roman Empire? You may have been able to figure it out. I hope you have. And that is, who is the beneficiary of paying off the Regensburg authorities? Who is going to be the beneficiary of this? Is it only the town of Regensburg, or is it actually Jews throughout the entire Holy Roman Empire? Rabbi Yosef Cologne believes that this ruling instructs who has an obligation here. And so he found an excellent precedent. However, there's going to be a discussion about the reality, and the reality is who is in fact in danger by what's going on in Regensburg. So one of the things that happened in Regensburg is that they froze the assets of all of the Jews who were living there. The anti-Semitic rhetoric was through the roof. They were literally, ready to kill 17 innocent people. And an important fact to know was that these things spread like wildfire. That's very important to know as well. And so an assessment needs to be made. Let's read text 5a on page 112 from Rabbi Yosef Cologne as he begins the Responsa, otherwise known as a teshuva, or if you look right under a wider thread, Rabbi Yosef Cologne, she'elot u'tshuvot. Right? She'elah is a question and tshuva is an answer. And that's, again, just as a reminder, the name of these books are called Shailas or Tshuvas, questions and answers. And so this is the beginning of his discussion of the answer to the question that was sent to him by the rabbis of Regensburg. It is well known and widely recognized that the imprisonment of our brethren from the holy community of Regensburg, may their rock, Almighty God, protect and strengthen them, is an event that poses potential harm and danger not only to Regensburg and its surrounding areas, but to many other communities as well. The rabbis who have gathered at Nuremberg to save those wrongly sentenced to death emphasize this point in their letter to me. So the rabbis were wise enough who posed the question, being that they themselves were rabbis, so they knew the factors important. You see, I'll tell you something else also. It is very important that when you ask a rabbi a question, that you give him the relevant information that he'll need to know in order to be able to answer that question. If you don't do that, then you can make it more difficult for him to give you a proper answer. That's something that's very good to know, by the way. Okay, so the rabbis of Nuremberg, who were the rabbis who gathered together to ask this question, being that they were scholars themselves, they understood which pieces of information are important for him to know. And one of them is this point that they argued, that this is a danger. This is not our problem. This is the Holy Roman Empire's problem. Because today it's our community, tomorrow it's going to be a different community. We'll discuss this a little bit more later. Obviously, that point has to be strongly argued in order to make any case over here. So that being the case, let's look at page 112, where we have the next question. You see how we're breaking this down. So every idea leads to another question. So given this reality, how might the aforementioned Talmudic passage apply to the question of funding the release in Regensburg? So how is this going to impact whether you can impose a tax or not? Well, the Rabbi Yosef Cohen will do this himself in text 5b. Let's read text 5b, which is on page 114. In my humble opinion, any Jewish community that is reasonably at risk and would almost certainly face the same fate, God forbid, if this matter is not properly addressed, these communities must take part in the financial burden. He's basically saying that this is something that can easily and very likely flow into other communities, which means that this is not only a danger for Regensburg, this is a danger for the entire, for every city under the Holy Roman Empire. Saving the holy community of Regensburg ultimately means saving themselves as well, while the opposite outcome in Regensburg would bring dire consequences to them, heaven forbid. Even though at this moment the libel is directed only at Regensburg and not at other locations, still, because the calamity would inevitably spread to them as well, they are judged based on what is bound to occur, obligating them to contribute to the expenses of saving the holy community of Regensburg. May the rock protect and strengthen them. Now, as he believed, and this is where he's using, in fact, his own assessment based on everything that he knows, based on the reality on the ground. And again, this could be debated, although it seems very strongly, as we'll see in a minute, will bring evidence to the fact that he was right on target with this, that he's saying that this is a danger that is for many, many cities and for the entire Holy Roman Empire. And therefore, everyone has to pitch in, because if we don't stop it here and we let our brethren get killed and we don't redeem them, then that's going to heighten the whole hype of blood libels. If we release them, which is an argument that they were innocent, that's why they weren't killed, as they were in Trenk, then that will at least alleviate somewhat, pull some of the steam out of these blood libels. Evidence, in my opinion, can be found in the Talmud, tractate Bava Metzia. So he says, I can bring proof to this, which obligates those living higher up to assist those below in repairing a drainage canal to direct water out of the city. Why do the people in the living above have to help repair the drainage canal? Because the people higher up are in danger if they don't. They are beneficiaries. The reasoning is that if the lower waters do not flow out, the upper waters will remain trapped in the higher areas. It is obvious that when water is blocked at the bottom of the channel, it does not immediately impact the higher portion of the channel. Rather, the water gradually rises until it affects the upper area. Nevertheless, and here's a key point he's making here. He's saying that if the drainage channel gets blocked, the water slowly starts to back up. But in the meantime, the people on the top, they're fine. It's going to take a while for it to back up. So even though it didn't yet back up to their place, the fact that it is going to lead to an issue for them, they're already obligated now to participate in clearing the drainage channel. And in the same way, even though there isn't a blood libel yet in all the other cities, it's only a matter of time, and therefore they have to participate now to alleviate this issue. Rather, the water gradually rises until it affects the upper area. Nevertheless, because the damage will eventually reach the upper area, there is no distinction between earlier and later, and the people higher up are required to assist now, even before they are experiencing damage. The same applies here. Even though the immediate harm and danger is currently befalling the holy community of Regensburg, it is well known that others are also at risk. Heaven forbid. They are therefore obligated to assist them, as I have explained. So here we can see a classic scenario where the rabbi is using a Talmudic precedent in order to demonstrate that a certain principle which now applies. He applies perfectly to our scenarios. If we look at the screen here, who is in danger at first glance? Regensburg. Who's obligated to pay? At first glance, Regensburg. Marik's reasoning is Regensburg and other communities are in danger. It's not just Regensburg. And so who's obligated to pay? Regensburg and the other communities. You can impose a tax on all Jewish communities in the Holy Roman Empire. Which leads us to our next question on page 115. Are you content with Rabbi Colon's argument? Can you identify any weaknesses in his comparison of the Talmudic case to the matter at hand? Because this is exactly how another rabbi might come and argue with Rabbi Yosef Colon and say, I hear what you're saying, but there's some point you're overlooking here, right? And that's something that we could analyze as well, by the way, any one of us. You don't need to be a rabbi to be intelligent, right? And as long as you're working within the framework of Talmudic and Torah principles, you're doing, then you're perfect. You're a full-fledged authority to make a point. So here's the historical reality was such that future harm was considered a certainty. The ruling and obligation to contribute was not charity, but a financial duty. Let's look at, you see, the main point over here of Rabbi Yosef Colon was that, just a moment. Oh, you see, the weakness that one might argue, I already sort of spoke this out already. The weakness that one might argue to Rabbi Yosef Colon's argument is, when it comes to the water, it's just a matter of time. It's an inevitable reality that the upper town is going to get affected. It's just a matter of time. But with the blood libel, it's a possibility. It's not an inevitability. It's not definitely going to happen. It's probably going to happen. That's what someone can argue. So comes Rabbi Yosef Colon and says, no, historical reality has demonstrated that it's a certainty that there will be blood libels in other cities if we don't remove the steam from this case by saving our brothers. This is a key point in his argument. Text 5c. Now again, I can see that there will be different opinions about this. However, the Ma'arik was a very great authority and well respected, and so his opinion carried very heavy weight. So I will say this also. I'll add this element that in order, one of the aspects of halakhic rulings does have to do with in some way the weight of the rabbi who is ruling. And that is built based on also reputation of ability that the rabbi demonstrates, which which lends a lot of weight to him, that other rabbis developed tremendous respect for his insight and his ability to draw principles from previous precedents. And the Rabbi Yisrael was one such person. But we're going to see, in fact, that we can know today, and even then they could have known that he was right on target.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Rabbi, you gave us additional information prior to telling us about the Regensburg challenge. You had told us that this had already happened in Trent.
Correct.
So that we knew this was already a problem for the Jewish population in the Holy Roman Empire where they were living.
Correct.
So it was Rabbi Cologne right on the mark, because we already saw it happening. And as soon as you said, why is Rabbi mentioning Trent, where it says Regensburg?
Well,
Trent, that made it clear.
Yeah. Actually, if you want to jump, everyone, thank you, Candy. Let's jump actually for a second to where is it? Okay. So I just want to mention again, I'm looking now with regards to the Reagan, I'm looking now at the chat box, but I may be missing comments in the chat box. I just want to mention that. With regards to the Regensburg ransom, is there not a principle regarding the payment of exorbitant ransoms? The will encourage more ransoms. Yes, there is. Very good. Ari's bringing in something we learned in a previous course about our Israel actually seminar, that we do not give exorbitant amounts of money to ransom individuals if that's going to lead to more hostages taken, that hostages taken for a higher ransom. So I think that this case, Ari, would be an exception, because the idea over here was not for ransom. That's not why they took them. They took them to accuse them of a blood libel and to kill them. But then they were being stopped from killing them by the emperor. And then they argued that the emperor doesn't have jurisdiction over them, and so they came to they came to an agreement of ransom. So that's why I think this is different. But going back to what Candy said, if everyone can look at page 117, we'll jump to page 117 for a second. You see the figure 3.3, libels during the 1470s in the Holy Roman Empire. You can see 1470 a blood libel, 1470 a blood libel, 1470 a blood libel, 1474 is Regensburg, right? Trent, Regensburg, Passau. It continued on in Nuremberg, right? In Salzburg. This went on. So, and by the way, if you look at the chart and all of the dots there, you'll see where all of these blood libels were. And so it's very clear that this was really a blood libel. So your point is very well taken, Candy, which was definitely behind his thinking and his ruling. Let's read text 5c. One might attempt to distinguish and argue that in the Talmudic case, the obligation for those higher up to assist is because the eventual damage to them is inevitable. However, here, one might say that the spread of this false and slanderous accusation to other places is uncertain. We don't know for sure there'll be blood libels in other cities. But in truth, we see that, sadly, there's a focused conspiracy to attack and incite against us. May God, in his abundant mercy, save us from their hands. In such a situation, the harm is considered to be certain. About this, in such cases, it is said in Proverbs, praised is the person who is always vigilant. So basically, he felt very clearly that this is an impending problem that's going to repeat itself. And therefore, bottom line is, the ruling is the obligation to contribute was not a charity, but it was actually a financial duty. Now, which communities exactly were included in this concern that would have to participate? So that he left, like how far out does this go? So that he left to the rabbis in Nuremberg, the body of rabbis in Nuremberg who are going to put this together to determine that, as well as to determine how much everyone has to give. It took them a while, by the way, with all of this, but finally, in the year 1480, 3.5 years after the imprisonment, can you imagine? Sadly, these 18 leaders from the city of Regensburg sat in prison for 3.5 years after having been tortured beyond what we would ever want to imagine. And if you ever read the testimony of anyone that was tortured during the Inquisition, which, by the way, this is around just before that time, which Spain was already, by the way, torturing Jews. It was quite horrific, and not a single libel Um, Under the emperor's reign, there was not a single libel after this, demonstrating that the release of them was very, very helpful in very, very helpful in diffusing this that the blood libels became weakened because the emperor didn't accept that this was a blood libel. I just want to say parenthetically also, just like I feel like I should throw this in, everyone always asks the question, what do we do about anti-Semitism? Now, you probably know that the idea of a blood libel is from the most ridiculous accusations you can accuse Jews of, because the Torah states in numerous places that blood, a Jew is not allowed to eat blood. In fact, if one cuts themselves on their finger and you're bleeding, you're not supposed to lick it to clean it off, because then you will be eating blood. Only blood that's within the mouth already is one allowed to swallow. Otherwise, one's not allowed to eat blood, and that's the reason why kosher meat and chicken is always salted before we eat it, because the salt draws out the blood. So here you see, but yet the uncreative Gentiles could not come up with a better libel than something that's explicitly forbidden in the Torah, and yet they still accused us of it, showing you how entirely irrational anti-Semitism is. It's pure hate is really what it is. And we're not going to fix it by being nice to the Gentiles. I'm not saying, by the way, what I mean by that is not that we should not be nice to the Gentiles. We should be nice to all people. But meaning we shouldn't blame ourselves and feel like we're doing something wrong, and that's the reason why they hate us. But that's the very, very brief on anti-Semitism. Okay. Let's now go to our next case. For any businessmen who are in class, you may get a kick out of this. This is a classic. This case was brought to the Rivash. The Rivash was a Spanish rabbi as well, who, if you can see on page 119, his bio, he lived 1326 to 1408. In the 14th century, he lived in Valencia, Spain. Now he received a question. He received a question from a fellow rabbi in the nearby city of Shativa, Spain. What was the question? Text number 6. So here I am in Aventura, Florida. My son-in-law is a Chabad rabbi here, working in a very big, prominent Chabad house, which I'm teaching the class from right now on the 4th floor. And they have a South American community, primarily Venezuelan, where my son-in-law is from. And when you sit in their beautiful sanctuary, many of the seats have a name on the armrest of that seat, because, as he explained to me, that when they built the synagogue, they permitted people to pay a certain fee, and with that fee, you get a seat assigned to you. And as long as you maintain your membership, I'm saying this all for a reason, as long as you maintain your membership, then you still have your seat. So it was a few $1,000s to buy a seat, and then you pay your annual membership and you maintain your seat. But if you lapse your membership, you automatically lose your seat. What does that tell you? That tells you that who owns the actual chair in the synagogue, the seat? The synagogue owns it, right? Proof of that is, if someone lapses in there, they move to Israel. So they stop paying a membership here, then they lose their seat. Showing that it's not owned, it's some form of a lease, you may say, or a rental, but it's not ownership. This is going to relate to the story in Shativa, Spain, where they also sold seats, but they didn't do it as wisely as they did in Aventura, Florida. Okay, so text number 6, to Shativa, to the God-fearing Rabbi Pinchas bar Shalemia Luno. Question: a community has a synagogue in their city. A wealthy man from the city purchased many seats there at a low price. What does he do? They're selling seats at a low price because they want people to buy up the seats in the synagogue. See, he's into real estate. No, Jews are into real estate. So he buys up, 20 seats. Due to his actions, now there are less seats available on the market. The value of the seats increased. As the price rose, he raised the rental fees. He didn't need 20 seats. So why is he buying all these seats? Because he's going to rent them out. Now that the value of the seats have increased, real estate has gone up because of supply and demand. Now he can rent out the seats that he bought at a low price for a higher price, to the point that the renters were deterred from attending the synagogue because of the high cost of seating. The rent was so high that Jews were not coming to the synagogue. It was too expensive. So it wasn't maybe it wasn't such a wealthy community, and so they couldn't afford it. The community wanted to, so what did the community do? So we have a problem. This guy bought seats fair and square. He did. We sold them, right? Maybe we didn't have a good system, but here we are. We're stuck. We got a problem. And people are not coming to the synagogue now. So they wanted to add more seats in available spaces within the synagogue and sell those seats to various people. They said, okay, we'll narrow the row. We'll make our synagogue look like the very first airplane where you can barely get down the aisle, because we're going to add more seats. And this way we'll be able to sell more seats. This would benefit the community financially. First of all, raise the money for the synagogue, and also encourage more people to attend the synagogue using newly added seats, which they won't have to rent for an exorbitant amount of money, because now that will drop the value of the seats. However, the wealthy man objected. Comes the wealthy man who bought all the seats, a whole batch of seats, arguing that the new seats would restrict access to his seats. He says, well, 1 second. You can't put it. When I bought seats in this synagogue, I bought it with the understanding that I have a clear pathway to get to my chair. Now I'm going to bang my knees trying to get to my seat. You can't do this. It's not fair. Even if there would still be sufficient space to pass through, the passage would be narrower than before. Even though we could get through it, but it's going to be narrower, it's going to be less pleasant. And I paid for seats with a pleasant pathway to get to them. You asked, so the Rivash is writing to the rabbi of Shetiva that you asked whether the wealthy man is justified in his claim. Wow, you think you have problems? Listen to this. Okay, so this is the problem. So the main point we have to just remember is that unlike today, they actually, in this story in Spain, which was not the case in many other synagogues, but in this synagogue, this is what they did. Unlike today, they actually owned the seats. So it was a real estate asset. So Spain, 1300s. Whoop. And a wealthy man bought many shul seats, causing prices to skyrocket. People stopped coming to shul. The community sought to add more seats, but the wealthy man objected. Got a problem. Okay. What does Rabbi Gordon always say? Problem, Houston, we have a problem, however it goes. Okay. Not easy to open up a new, it's not easy to open up a new shul. Also, the other issue that they had was to go open up a new shul was not a simple matter either. Why not? Because you required government approval, and the government was very restrictive about how many synagogues can be opened and where they can be opened. So it was much easier for them to just add seats. And the seat investor objects. Do we have a synagogue precedent from the Talmud? They didn't really have synagogues in this fashion in the Talmud, in the times, or these scenarios at least, or precedent from the Talmud. So they did have gathering. I'm sorry, they did have gathering to pray, but so how would we approach this issue? So the Rivash approached it very simply. He approached it as a real estate dilemma. We have a real estate dilemma. These are the laws of real estate because it was sold as real estate. Synagogue seat speculator. 1 second. Can the shul add more seats, taking space from the wealthy man's aisles? And here we're going to discuss Talmudic real estate. Okay? What is the scenario that the Rivash is going to refer to? Let's go to text number 7. Text number 7, which will then explain, we will then explain it by looking at the figure. 3.4. Rav Huna says, if a resident of a lane wants to build a structure on the lane adjacent to their courtyard entrance, the other residents of the lane can prevent this because it will require them to circumvent the structure. Okay. So when someone studies the Talmud, Maimonides, Rambam, you know there's an idea called a mavui. A mavui, they are translating here as a lane. The lane is in figure 3.4, the lane is B. You see, that lane is a lane that leads into, it's basically like a road, it's a semi-private road that leads into courtyards. This was the classic way that real estate was established during the days of the Talmud. And then each courtyard was like an open space for like the front yard for many different homes, as you can see hopefully in the picture. If you want to put a bench in A, which is your courtyard, by your front door, Gesundheit, we say in Yiddish, totally fine, it's not a problem, you can do that. But in real estate law in the Talmud, if you want to put a bench in B, in that open area where everyone goes to walk, someone can come and say, hey, what are you doing? Right? You're going to require me to walk around your bench to get to my door. Right? What gives you the right to do that? And in fact, the Talmud says that the person doesn't have the right to do that. You see where you see some comparison. Here you can see some comparison pretty easily, right? So Talmudic real estate law, one has no right to diminish the access of a sheared lane. So we have a question now. What's our question? Go to page 121. How would Rabbi Yitzchak the Rivash, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Shesh's rule on the synagogue seat dispute in light of this Talmudic passage? How would the Rivash rule based on what the Talmud says? What do you think? I think I know what you think. Can the shul add more seats, taking space from the wealthy man's wide aisles? The ruling, no. The community has no right to diminish this access. Why? Because this access is like a mavui. It's like the lane that all of the individual pieces of real estate share. And you cannot take from that space and cause inconvenience for anyone else. So he found a precedent in the Talmud, which seems like a very direct precedent, in my opinion, and sounds like a very good precedent.
Rabbi, there's no question about whether or not the space is to sit on a bench or to come to shul. Like, isn't the weight of what the use is for the easement, doesn't that come into play at all?
The Talmud doesn't give us any clauses. You need to demonstrate from the Talmud that that we differentiate. The Talmud doesn't say this you're allowed to do, that you're not allowed to do. Right? Or under these circumstances, yes, under those circumstances, no. And playing the religious card is, I don't know if that's what the argument that you're trying to make, but playing the religious card doesn't really work here because religious is following the Talmud. So that's what religious is, right?
Okay.
The fact that the fact that, someone says, I want to do something holy, I'm going to repeat you what a lot of people in the shul already know because I repeat it often. I quote my mother, who always says, don't be religious on someone else's expense. That's how my mother raised us. Don't be religious on someone else's expense. Meaning if you're being religious, we call it, when she meant, you want to be super pious, but it's costing someone else. That's not super pious. So now, I want to pray in synagogue. So, you have to take away from your space. You have to make your life inconvenient because I want to pray in synagogue. It's not a strong argument. Again, if you do find precedent in the Talmud, then we can then we have something to talk about. So, however, a good rabbi, it's not just a good rabbi, but definitely a good rabbi, but also a good person. When someone comes to you with a problem, you never, the Rebbe told being that tomorrow night is Yud Shvat, the anniversary of the Rebbe's leader becoming the leader of Chabad, and his influence only grows stronger every day. The Rebbe encouraged doctors, and I know a couple of different stories. If you have a patient, and this has been a guiding principle for me when it's relevant. when you have a patient, he told the doctor that because once someone came to him, to the Rebbe, and told the Rebbe that my doctor said there's no hope. He has nothing he can do for me. And he was devastated. Now, this man was a Chabad Chassid, and his doctor was too. So the Rebbe sent a message to the doctor, how can you leave a patient so forlorn? He doesn't have any, you leave him without any hope. You never leave a patient without hope. If nothing else, tell him to suck candies, because sucking candies will be good for him. You always have to give a patient hope. No matter what the scenario is, you never leave people without hope. So this is not such a serious circumstance that we're talking about. But the Rivash, someone came in with a problem, so you may say the ruling is such and such. The law in Jewish law is such and such. But may I suggest maybe a way to deal with the issue? And that's what the Rivash does. He says, text, let's go to text number 8. Text number 8 says, the residents of a city may establish local standards for measurements, product pricing, and wages, and impose fines for noncompliance. When you're in a city has the right to establish a board or whoever it is, and they determine local standards, and they can enforce those local standards. So he said, why don't you as a community set caps on shul seat rentals? Say, we're setting a cap on, yes, its value is much greater, but we're setting a cap for the sake of the means of the people in our city, that you can't charge more than such and such on seat rentals. Now you solve your whole problem. You don't have to add new seats. People will start coming to shul again. And the rich guy thought he outsmarted everybody, but he didn't. Of course, according to Talmud, and again, where he brings a precedent from the Talmud that you can do this. That's the big key. The big key is precedent from the Talmud. If any rabbi tells you any ruling, and they tell you because it makes sense, or because that's what I understand, that is an illegitimate ruling, which has no basis in Torah, and has nothing to do with the will of God, and should be rejected, by the way. City residents and leaders, they can legislate economic norms, and therefore he suggested that's what they should do. Question on page 122, how might this passage help adjudicate the case of the synagogue seat dispute? Well, when you set caps on seat rentals, you have rent control. And rent control, when done properly, can be effective. We won't get into that. It's a very sensitive subject to New Yorkers today. But rent control, when done properly, can actually solve a problem. And he felt that would solve their problem. And basically, from all of the details of the case that we have, it sure sounds like it would. And it would restore the participation of the congregants. And that's exactly what the community wanted. Okay, now we are going to go to technology. We're going to fly to more recent, a little bit more recent, and then very much more recent. Okay? Technology raises a lot of halachic questions because we have new technology that does odd things that was never done before. And the question is, how do they fit into the principles of Torah law? And this is an amazing thing, by the way, this is the amazing thing of the Torah. And that I mentioned this earlier in our morning women's class. The Torah is truth. We call it Torah Emet, the Torah of truth. And the Torah is true because it was given by the one being who is absolutely true, and that is Almighty God. We say Hashem Elokeichem Emet. God is true. Why is God true? Because God absolutely is unconditional. God always was, is, and will be. God's infinite. So therefore, God is really the ultimate of all truth. Nothing is as true as God is, because almost everything else we know has an expiration date, which means it's not absolutely true. True means that it is eternal. So the wisdom of God is also eternal. And that's why anything the Torah says remains true for all times. But not only that, it's so true that it will guide any scenario that we experience in this world, which is really, when you experience it firsthand, is amazing to see how, sometimes, God forbid, they think that the Torah is archaic, and suddenly you realize that we have a book of principles that will literally deal with any scenario you can possibly come up with as the world is coming up with all of these new things that no one ever conceived of. And the Torah has guidance for every single one of them. So Hashem created everything for a purpose. Kol ma shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu, anything that Almighty God created, He created for His glory. And that means that we are meant to use everything that God creates for a holy purpose, for a good purpose. So we're not intimidated by technology. We embrace technology. We use Zoom to teach Torah classes. Fantastic, right? We embrace technology. Now, technology also comes with risks, and that's fine. We have to be careful. But we still use technology for good. So when we have technology, we don't run away from it. We ask ourselves, how can we use this in a manner which would not only be permissible according to Torah law, but actually bring more holiness into the world? However, we have to ask the questions of how we can do that according to halacha. Now, if you want to see something really cool, as my kids would say, and I've begun saying, then you can look on page 124, and you'll see a whole bunch of scenarios, which we're really not going to spend time on, but I'll fly through maybe a little bit quickly. The astrolabe, we're going to discuss in just a few minutes, so we're going to skip that. An hourglass, can a sand glass be moved on Shabbos? So the question of whether it can be moved on Shabbos. I'm going to skip this one for now because I don't want to get into the details of what that question is. A spinning wheel, a talus made of silk. Should the tassels, that tzitzis, be made of wool, linen, or silk? This is a whole discussion. All of these require a lot of background, so I'm not going to get into all of them. The printing press. Do printed Jewish books have the same sanctity as manuscripts? We know that if you have a mezuzah, parchment with ink written with God's name, you have to bury it. Right? If it's not kosher, a Torah like that, you have to bury it. What about printed material? Does that have to be buried? The answer is yes. But why? That discussion, right? There's a question about firearms. A question about the telescope, seeing the moon with a telescope. Can you open up an umbrella on Shabbos? Right? The answer is no. By the way, we don't use umbrellas on Shabbos because you're making a tent above you. It's like making a structure above you. But whatever it is, you have to learn a lot of nuances to really appreciate this. It's a question about a physician administering a vaccine on Shabbos, when that might be the only time that the physician who's traveling through town will be there. Is machine matzah kosher for Passover? Oh, you may not have even known that was a question, right? You see it all over the place. That's a big question, a big debate. Some people say yes, some people say no. Generally speaking, it's, many people use it on Passover, but as a stringency, many people won't use machine-made matzah on Passover. When machines, I'll give you one point in the discussion of this. I just want to say machine-made matzah is kosher for Passover. And that's why you see it everywhere. However, if you want to know why, if you come into my home or some other people's homes, you'll only see handmade matzah. That's because there was a debate and some rabbis forbade machine-made matzah, even though we don't rule like them. But for that reason, we're strict, especially on Passover, when we're very strict about what we eat. You see, in machines, when they operate, they get hot, as we know. And so even though the machines follow the 18-minute rule from when the water and flour mix, it has to be baked within 18 minutes before it rises. But we know that heat also contributes to the rising of dough. So there's one of the questions discussed regarding machine-made matzah is, does the heat of the machine mean that we need less than 18 minutes? Because it will make it chametz. That's just part of the discussion. All right. The telegraph has halachic questions. The locomotive raised halachic questions. Electricity, photographs, and the hot air balloon, which we're going to get to soon. Okay, so that's just for you to be able to see many, and I can give you an endless number of questions related to technology. But we're going to begin with the astrolabe. What is the astrolabe? The astrolabe is a mechanism that was brilliantly designed. Actually, I'm going to show you what it is. Let's watch this video. Here we go. I thought it was here. Oh, here it is. One second.
Question is this. What time is it? What time is it? if you glance at your iPhone, it's so simple to tell the time. But I'd like to ask you, how would you tell the time if you didn't have an iPhone? How would you tell the time, say, 600 years ago? How would you do it? Well, the way you would do it is by using a device that's called an astrolabe. So an astrolabe is relatively unknown in today's world, but at the time, in the 13th century, it was the gadget of the day. It was the world's first popular computer, and it was a device that, in fact, is a model of the sky. So the different parts of the astrolabe in this particular type. The rete corresponds to the position of the stars, the plate corresponds to a coordinate system, and the mater has some scales and puts it all together. If you were an educated child, you would know how to not only use the astrolabe, you would also know how to make an astrolabe. And we know this because the first treatise on the astrolabe, the first technical manual in the English language, was written by Geoffrey Chaucer. Yes, that Geoffrey Chaucer in 1391 to his little Lewis, his 11-year-old son. And in this book, little Lewis would know the big idea. And the central idea that makes this computer work is this thing called stereographic projection. And basically the concept is, how do you represent the three-dimensional image of the night sky that surrounds us onto a flat, portable two-dimensional surface? The idea is actually relatively simple. Imagine that the Earth is at the center of the universe, and surrounding it is the sky projected onto a sphere. Each point on the surface of the sphere is mapped through the bottom pole onto a flat surface where it's then recorded. So the North Star corresponds to the center of the device. The ecliptic, which is the path of the sun, moon, and planets, correspond to an offset circle. The bright stars correspond to little daggers on the rete, and the altitude corresponds to the plate system. Now, the real genius of the astrolabe is not just the projection. The real genius is that it brings together two coordinate systems so they fit perfectly. There's the position of the sun, moon, and planets on the movable rete, and then there's their location on the sky as seen from a certain latitude on the back plate. Okay? So how would you use this device? Well, let me first back up for a moment. This is an astrolabe. Pretty impressive, isn't it? And so this astrolabe is on loan from us from the Oxford School of Museum of History, and you can see the different components. This is the mater, the scales on the back. This is the rete, okay, do you see that? That's the movable part of the sky. And in the back you can see like a spiderweb pattern, and that spiderweb pattern corresponds to the local coordinates in the sky. This is a rule device, and on the back are some other devices, measuring tools, and scales to be able to make some calculations, okay? You know, I've always wanted one of these. For my thesis, I actually built one of these out of paper. This is a replica from a 15th century device, and it's worth probably about 3 MacBook Pros, but a real one would cost about as much as my house.
Okay, I think we've seen everything we need to regarding that. And let me explain. So now the astrolabe is basically the like 3, or maybe it sounded like to me like 3 layers that you put one on top of the other, and then you can assess by positioning it what time it is. And so if you look in text number 9 on page 131, to Perpignan, which was a town or a city in southern France near Spain, this was being written by the Rajba, who we had in lesson number 1, Rabbi ben Aderet, where he was asked regarding your question, is it permitted to use an astrolabe on Shabbos? Can you put together this mechanism on Shabbos or not? Well, what is the actual question behind the question? The question behind the question is it boneh, which means building? One is not allowed to build something on Shabbos. This seems like it's building. You're putting together something and creating an astrolabe. So he brought a precedent from the Talmud text number 10. What does the Talmud in text number 10 say? In the house of Rav Chama, there was a sectional bed which they would reassemble on the festivals. One of the sages said to him, "What is your reasoning to permit it? You can't assemble something. Assembling something is building it." He replied, "I agree with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who said that if it is loose fitting, it is permitted. If it's loose fitting things that you're putting together, it's not building. Building is only when it's put together very tightly, so it's actually being held together." So assembling something loose-fitting does not fall under the prohibition of boneh and is therefore permissible on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So question, how might this, on page 132, the question is, how might this ruling help resolve whether assembling an astrolabe is permitted on Shabbos? The answer is that an astrolabe actually is loose-fitted. The astrolabe doesn't require force to assemble, so it is permitted to assemble and use it on Shabbos. Now you may say, I never saw an astrolabe, I never will see an astrolabe, and I'm not interested in astrolabes. Okay, fine. So I'll give you an example that you can relate to. Can you play with Lego on Shabbos? I know you love Lego. I know. So can you play with Lego on Shabbos? Right? That's the question. When you put two pieces of Lego together, they're held together very strongly. Sometimes it's very hard to separate them. And this is a big discussion in Jewish law today. Whether putting together two pieces of Lego is boneh, is construction, is building. And that's why they say that many people say that only children under bar and bat mitzvah play with Lego on Shabbos. But once you're over bar bat mitzvah, which I think includes all of us, then you should not play with Lego because it is held tightly together. And according to some people, it seems pretty clear that would be a violation of boneh of building on Shabbos. Okay, and that would be another example of a modern day scenario. Now we have another situation, hot air balloon. In 1908, before the festival, Ahali of Sukkot, the rabbi of Lodz, Rabbi Moshe Perlmutter, wondered, I heard that there's this new thing, and I even saw, called a hot air balloon, and not only do they have this hot air balloon that can fly up in the sky, they also can have it hover in one spot. Well, you may know, and if you don't, I'll explain to you, that there are laws regarding a sukkah. Jewish law requires that a sukkah be built directly under the sky. You cannot have your sukkah built where there is a tree that the branches of the tree go over your sukkah. You have to make sure it's under the sky. It's actually very, very good to know, by the way. That's why if you have a deck, let's say, where you build your sukkah, but you have a big tree that comes over that deck, that's a problem. I had to, a couple of years ago, had one of my trees trimmed, simply so that the branches wouldn't come over the sukkah where we place our sukkah. So if a tree hangs over the sukkah, even if it's high up, it can be much higher than your sukkah, it invalidates the sukkah. So what was Rabbi Perlmutter's question? What happens now with this new thing called a hot air balloon? What happens if it decides to hover over my sukkah? Does it now invalidate my sukkah or not? That was his question, and he sent his question to the Maharsh Dam. The Maharsh Dam, the Maharsh Dam, Rabbi Sholem Mordechai HaKohen, answered the question. Let's look at text number 11. Our teacher, Rabbi Sholem Mordechai HaKohen, judge in the community of BEREZHANY, live and be well. I have been struck. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah. I have been struck by a new matter that has never risen before. Inventors have recently brought into reality the ability to soar into a hot air balloon. Humans control it so that if they want to remain stationary at a high altitude, they can do so, remaining there even when there are strong winds. The hot air balloon is large in both length and width. What is the halachic status of a sukkah if a hot air balloon is seen hovering directly above it? Might this render the sukkah invalid? That was his question. So he pens this question to the Maharsh Dam, Rabbi Shvadron. And Rabbi Shvadron says, I will answer your question. And he's going to answer the question based on a law, a precedent in the Talmud, regarding a Kohen. A Kohen, such as I am, is a person who was born to a father who is a Kohen. My father's a Kohen, so I'm a Kohen. Kohen are the people who would do the service in the temple, and they are not allowed to make themselves impure, spiritually impure. Most commonly, that would be by exposing themselves to a corpse, to a dead body. That's the reason why, by the way, I do not officiate at funerals, because I'm a Kohen, so I cannot do so, and I can't go into cemeteries, and I can't go into a funeral home. So at best, you'll see me in a special Kohen room, which is an attachment built to the Goldstein funeral home, but it's not a part of the funeral home. So in other words, what you need to know is that if there is a dead body, even hospitals could be a problem because of this. If there's a dead Jewish body in a building, I cannot be under the same roof as that body, because if I am, then the purity spreads under everything that's under that ceiling, and if I stand under that same ceiling, then that impurity, I would be spiritually impure. Now, the Talmud asks a fascinating question. You would never think that the Talmud asks such a question, but the Talmud asks about a flying tent. Can you imagine that? Now, there were no planes then. It was way before there were even planes, and we're already asking about things that are flying. Look at text number 12. The following do not bring impurity: a flying cloak and a ship floating on the water. What's this talking about? It's saying what happens if there is a corpse on the ground and there's a coin, and the coin's 10 feet away from the corpse, and suddenly a big cloak that's 20 feet long flies up, gets blown by the wind, blows up, and so happens that it's covering both the corpse and the coin at the same time. Does the coin now become spiritually impure? Because it's like being under the same roof. Same thing, what happens if I decide to go scuba diving, and while I'm scuba diving, and suddenly I realize, tragically, there's some corpse floating in the water, and suddenly a big ship comes over both of us, and now it's a roof, it's a covering over me and the corpse at the same time. Do we say that now the impurities that I'm contracting an impurity? So what does the Talmud say? A flying cloak in the ship on the water. And Mishnah, by the way, it's a Mishnah. However, if the ship is tied with something, the following do not bring impurity. A flying cloak doesn't bring impurity, and a ship floating in the water doesn't bring impurity. However, if the ship is tied with something, if it's anchored, that keeps it steady, or a stone is on the cloak, holding part of it down, they can bring impurity. If in any way it's being anchored in place, so even though it's flapping or whatever it is, but it's still being anchored in place, then it would create impurity. So comes the Marshdam and says, now you have the answer to the hot air balloon. Well, what's the answer? Question, look at 134. How might this ruling help resolve whether a hot air balloon hovering over a sukkah invalidates it? The answer is in text number 13. Bear with me, everyone. If you give me just another few minutes. I actually thought it was going to go quicker on Zoom. It seems like it's going slower on Zoom. But let's just finish up the class. So give me an extra 5 minutes, please. Text 13. By the grace of God, the third day of Chol HaMoed Sukkos, 1908, the Honorable Rabbi and Scholar of Moshe Perlmutter, Rabbi of Lodz, live and be well. Due to Chol HaMoed, I will be brief and respond succinctly, because we actually try not to write on Chol HaMoed. Those are the intermediary days of the holiday of Sukkos. It's interesting to me that he even responded then, because I don't think this was a relevant question. But anyway, as explained in chapter 8 of Mishnah Halot, a ship floating on water and a flying cloak do not bring impurity. This is true even if they are stationary, as noted by the commentaries. Only when the ship is tethered to land, and only when a stone is placed on the edge of the cloak does it qualify as a tent. Accordingly, in our case, the hot air balloon is not considered a tent and does not invalidate the sukkah beneath it. Why not? Because it is not anchored to the ground. And therefore, he has a very clear precedent from the Talmud. And we have just discovered the very main way that rabbis answer questions that come to them. That to wrap all of this up, I just want to say this, that this whole process of applying principles of Torah to the modern day is not just for the rabbis. It's for every one of us. We should all be doing this. When we study a Mishnah, when we study Talmud, when we even study the Torah, we can say, extrapolate. Here, this sounds like this scenario. Maybe we can learn from one to the other. I'm not saying you should make a halachic ruling on your own, because you're not a halachic authority, nor am I. But we can still, think these things through and then discuss it with halachic authority. Because the whole idea of God giving the Torah at Mount Sinai, as we discussed, was for God to bridge the human and the divine. God came down to the mountain and we went up. Moses went up as a representation of us. And what Torah accomplishes is that human intellect merges with the divine. So you have Torah law and you have human mind. This approach to Torah study bridges the gap between heaven and earth. You see, when we just learn Torah, we are engrossing ourselves in the wisdom of God. That's one level of learning Torah. But another level of learning Torah is human creativity in the context of God's wisdom of Torah. And that's where we're bringing what God has endowed us with into the wisdom of the Torah, which is exactly what God wants us to do. So the Maharik did this, right? Rabbi Yosef Kalon did this by thinking through sewage laws to blood libels. The Rivash did this by thinking through real estate laws to synagogue seating. The Rajba did this by seeking a law about putting together a bed to an astrolabe. And the Marshdam did this by learning from a flying cloak the laws of a hot air balloon. And that's very, very powerful. Let's read text number 14. Every one of us, page 138, every one of us can reveal secrets of wisdom, to reveal and to innovate new insights in halacha, agada, the revealed dimensions of the Torah in the Kabbalistic sphere. Indeed, we are obliged to do so to perfect our souls. We call this, we see, there's a certain type of a learning called halacha lamaisa. Halacha means law in actuality. Like, what is the law? But then there's halacha v'lo lamaisa. There's halacha which is not for the purpose of ruling a rule, but just of using my creativity to extrapolate from the Torah what would seem to me might be what the Torah would say about a certain modern day situation or about a new situation or whatever it may be. If I want to know if in fact this is the law, I will go to a rabbi who is a halachic rabbi who has that power and that position to be able to determine that.